Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is an immense game. Immense in scale, in what it sets out to do in its narrative, and immense in the pressure it's under to perform to live up to the legend of the original game. In this spoiler-free review, I'll be giving you my final thoughts on the game after having spent 60 hours playing it. 60 hours might sound like a lot, or it might not if you're somebody who plays a lot of RPGs, and that's the first thing that I want to touch upon here. When I said that this game was immense, I really meant it. Questions were immediately drawn with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, considering that it was no longer going to take place in the city of Midgar. Would Square Enix be able to capture the magic and the sense of adventure and the grand scale that the PS1 original did with its mini-chibi overworld? Or would it be like a more contemporary Final Fantasy, take 16 for example, where areas were tightly designed and felt perhaps a little wide, but ultimately when boiled down to their ethos, were very linear. It's safe to say that all the footage that you've seen in the trailers and in the pre-release material is all accurate. The game is incredibly open-ended with its structure. There'll always be a main story beat that you need to follow, marked off somewhere on your map, but you are welcome to come and go as you like, spending hours getting lost in plenty of the game's side content. And on the topic, one of the main concerns people potentially had was that this game was going to turn off into a Ubisoft Light, where the map was littered with numerous inconsequential points of interest that would clutter up the screen and effectively get irritating quite quickly, which, safe to say, is not what's happening here in Rebirth. Chadley, the Shinra creation from Final Fantasy VII Remake, who basically handled all of the VR simulation stuff he used to do in that game, makes a return in Rebirth, and here he's surveying the world, and so he tasks Cloud with effectively gathering as much data as possible. This includes things like hunting specific fiends or enemies down and defeating them with set criteria, finding hidden sanctuaries somewhere in the overworld that are dedicated to some of the classic Final Fantasy summons, or even with hunting down and finding proto-relics. These mysterious ethereal items that feature some of my favorite side quests in the game. These extracurricular activities were dotted around the map and came up somewhat infrequently, allowing me to take in the sights and soak up the world without being forced into one objective after another. Though if I wanted to take a break from the main narrative to go scout out some world intel, I definitely could. What I'm trying to say is, pacing here isn't necessarily an issue and is largely dictated by the actions that you as a player take. If you've played the original Final Fantasy VII, you'll feel very at home with the overall narrative and you'll know largely what is going to happen in this game. Though if you've played FF7 Remake, you'll largely know that the remake project isn't necessarily a verbatim copy of the original. All I can say is, definitely expect some shenanigans. The story goes places that you will and won't expect. The characters we've come to know and love make a return, that overall party is expanded somewhat, and the game features the return of the relationship system that the original did, where you're able to deepen the relationship between Cloud and his party members by answering their questions in specific ways, or taking them along with you to do some side quests. Somehow, they even ended up tying in the relationship system with the synergy, skills, and abilities that you can pull off in combat, but more on that later. Aside from that, of course, as usual, the fate of the world is at stake, and it's up to a bunch of unusual misfits to save the world. I don't want to say anything else about the narrative as I don't want to throw in any spoilers, but much like Remake beforehand, I'm curious and excited to see what happens in the next game. So let's move on to something that I can talk about, which is the game's combat. The ATB or Active Time Battle system returns from Remake, where you're able to fight either in real time or in a somewhat mishmash of a turn-based, for those of you who prefer that kind of gameplay. But the combat options that you have here are massively expanded, much to great effect. Square have taken the synergy system from the Integrate DLC and built upon it, allowing for an even greater variety of moves that you can pull off in combat, and also expanding the amount of strategy that you can throw in when tackling enemies. Synergy skills are unique combo abilities that provide great utility, allowing you to turn the tides against your enemies without even using any ATB. Or you can make use of synergy abilities, which are powerful attacks which also provide their own buffs, like extended stagger time or infinite NP for a limited time. And synergy is all nice and neatly wrapped up in the new folio system, where you're able to allot points for each of your party members, further customizing what abilities or buffs they have access to, allowing you to spec out your team exactly how you want. Alongside that, we see the return of the fan-favorite materia system alongside the weapon proficiency system, so if you've played Remake, you'll likely feel right at home here with Rebirth. Having said that, Square have done just enough here to make the combat feel fresh and revitalized, particularly with these new abilities and, of course, the new party members. For what it's worth, whilst we're talking about the combat, I played the game solely on performance mode, which prioritizes the frame rate over the resolution. Many of you who have played the demo will know that the game largely runs at a fairly smooth 60 FPS. During my playtime, that frame rate seemed fairly consistent. I didn't notice any huge or massive frame rate drops, even in large open areas or during fights with a lot of particle effects where you would assume the game would. I'm not 100% certain on what the overall resolution was, but I can tell from a fidelity perspective that the game definitely was a lot sharper than that initial demo, even when playing on performance mode. Harking back to Final Fantasy's long since past, you can certainly expect to play a plethora of minigames here in Rebirth. A few of my favorites happen to be the Junon Parade, which has been entirely reworked and expanded upon, where it seems as though Cloud really comes into his own being an employee of Shinra, and even provides an unexpected touching moment right at the end. The other minigame that really seemed to suck up a lot of my time ended up being Queen's Blood. As somebody who loves card minigames in video games overall, this was no surprise to me. The fact that each town is chock full of people looking to duel you at Queen's Blood doesn't help, or even the fact the game ends up throwing out several side quests and even a Queen's Blood tournament at you to get you invested. As somebody who's played the original Final Fantasy VII and the remake and Crisis Core, and somebody who's just a fan of Final Fantasy VII overall, it's really hard to find something that I didn't like about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Though if I had to put my thinking hat on and kind of step outside and change perspective here, I feel as though if you've not played the original Final Fantasy VII and perhaps maybe have only played Final Fantasy VII Remake, you're going to be very confused by the overall narrative of this game. And that pretty much was also my only gripe with FF7 Remake 4 years ago. The fact that you might be able to understand the story at a basic level if you've never played Final Fantasy VII, but a lot of the implications are going to fly right over your head if you've not either played the games or read up on some of the material. Having said all of that, I think Rebirth is a successful sequel. It effectively took everything that Remake was and built upon that framework, making it bigger and better in multiple ways. If you're somebody that liked Remake, or liked it but thought certain aspects might have been lacking, then you'll most likely enjoy Rebirth. But if you're somebody who didn't like Remake or didn't want more of the same, then you're likely in for a bit of a rough ride with the sequel. That does bring us to the end of this review. However, I will say that there is plenty more Final Fantasy VII Rebirth content coming shortly, so do stay tuned. I'm also interested in knowing, those of you who are going to pick up Rebirth, how many of you have actually played the original Final Fantasy VII? Let me know down in the comments below. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.